You're listening to a special preview episode of Legends Lookback, a Patreon-exclusive Utini podcast all about Star Wars Legends. If you like this content and want to hear more like it, head over to patreon.com/Utini.
From a galaxy far, far away. And a bookshelf straight out of the 90s. From Thrawn to Dantooine and everything in between. This is Legends Lookback.
Freddie, what I was telling Heather right before you came on is that we had to delay the recording of our show by one day. We're recording this on Tuesday. We're going to record on Monday, which worked out perfectly because my library got in this book that I reserved like last week, which is the Splinter of the Mind's Eye graphic novel.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and so I read it right before we recorded. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we get going in the show. But yeah, it was actually like the force is with us here as we're recording our episode.
Perfect timing.
That 1 day delay actually worked out perfectly for us. There's a full spread there of Luke about to slice and dice a stormtrooper.
That's awesome.
Absolutely. Well, you know what else is awesome? This episode of Legends Lookback, we are especially excited to get into the original Expanded Universe book. Welcome, everybody. This is our Patreon exclusive podcast brought to you by Utini.com, where we talk about all things Star Wars Legends. We're celebrating our rich EU history, as well as diving into lesser-known Star Wars classics. Once again, I'm your host, Jared Mays, and I'm joined by my good friend, Freddie C. How's it going, Freddie?
It's going pretty well. We're talking about a book that I feel like I just can't wait. How about that?
You know, we've got a commitment to positivity here at Utini, and if we get off the rails during the show, just go ahead and call us on it and say positivity. This might just be the last episode of Legends Look Back. We'll see if Corey pulls the plug on this or not after today. It's a doozy. We'll say that much. Today, of course, we're talking about Splinter of the Mind's Eye, and if you're listening to this show, you already know that because you're one of our incredible patrons, and you probably voted in our poll that we put up on Patreon. We wanted to get into something of the original trilogy era and something that was weird. Something a little bit off the beaten path, and Freddie said, what if we go with Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the original Expanded Universe book? And I said, oh, I don't know, but I'll put it up in the poll. We'll see what people think, and you guys must either love us or hate us, because this is what won. And we are joined, of course, by somebody who's been trying to read this book for weeks and weeks and weeks, if not years, and
it's
just
been years.
hasn't quite been able to make it happen, and that is, of course, our good friend Heather Goldman. How's it going, Heather?
Good. I'm so excited to be in my very first episode of Legends Look Back. I guess it had to be this book, though, huh?
It really is this book. We're excited to get you on at some point to talk about like your favorite Star Wars book, but it's your fault. You posted, I've been trying to read this book forever and just haven't quite been able to make it happen.
When will
And
I
said,
learn to keep my mouth shut?
I said, we just so happen to need a guest, and you haven't been on the show yet.
These
But,
are hazing.
Heather, if somebody's not real familiar with the goings-on at Utini, give us a quick rundown on what you do for the site.
Well, I joined Utini just a few months after Utini was originally created, and back then, we were actually a subscription box for Star Wars books. And
Right.
I was hired on to handle the social media aspect, and I actually still handle Utini's social media, and if anyone isn't following our official pages right now, not for the Living Force, but for the actual Utini pages, then please follow us because I am like revamping how we're posting, and I really
been a
hope
lot of
that
fun.
you'll like it. Yeah.
Heather is one of the OGs of Utini.
I kind of
Yeah.
feel like I'm talking to a celebrity here because I've watched the old school RPG shows off YouTube, and have enjoyed watching Heather in those, of course. And
Those were so fun.
there's always the ever infamous 2019 Utini Christmas party in which Heather was the star of the show.
Yeah,
Absolute
and
star.
you know what? I don't even really remember being the star of the show.
Oh, I remember it.
I'm pretty
remember
sure
it very
everyone
well.
but me remembers. For those who are lost, I drink a little too much. But I've been hoping that Corey would release that into the world somehow so I could listen to my own shenanigans.
You know, Heather, I don't know if it's a good thing that it's kind of been behind closed doors or not. If it ever gets out in the world, it'll be up for you to decide. But we're really excited to have you.
I was going to say, the funny thing about that whole thing is I remember I was at Rise of Skywalker, and I couldn't make the party. I was eating with some friends at IHOP. I grabbed my friend's keys. I'm like, I'm going to go talk to my friends. I'll be right back. I go into his car, lock the doors, I hop on, and Heather is absolutely lit. I'm like, oh goodness, I'm missing out on everything.
Yeah, the last thing I remember is crying.
Because of the end of Revenge of the Sith, or just because that's what was happening?
So the last scene I remember was Obi-Wan and Anakin's fight on Mustafar, and the very end when Obi-Wan says, "You were my brother, I loved you," I started crying so bad, and then that's when I just blacked out. I don't remember anything after that.
It'll get you. It really will.
Yeah, it will.
Well, we're excited to have you on this episode of Legends Look Back, Heather. And before we get into the meat of the episode, I do have some really exciting news. In case you guys didn't notice, with our last episode, we've got a big development with Legends Look Back. I mean, maybe most of you don't care at all, but I care, okay? I figured out how to get links in the show notes. So what that means, everybody, is if we're talking about some kind of cover art, which we'll do a little bit with this episode, if we're talking about being able to purchase the upcoming book, if we're announcing what we're going to be talking about next, something like that, you can actually, right there on your phone, open up your podcast player, pull up our episode that you're hopefully already listening to, and you can just click the link right then and there. You can throw Utini a couple of bucks as you use those affiliate links, or of course, you can be spared that difficult Google search, and you can have that artwork right there in the palm of your hand. You're welcome. Everybody appreciate them.
Way to go, Jared!
Okay. Yeah, there we go, Heather. Thank you. Freddie's just staring into the distance. Well, guys, this has been a fun episode. I've enjoyed it. Thanks for coming on the show, Heather. That's going to wrap it up.
Links.
Yay! I don't have to actually talk about the book.
No. Everybody, today we are in for a treat. We are talking about the 1978 classic, Splinter of the Mind's Eye. This was as I've mentioned, the first ever expanded universe novel. And what I mean by that, of course, is this is the first actual adult book that went into new territory. We, of course, had the original novelization for Star Wars that came out before the film, amazingly, in 1976. But following along those lines, the same author, Alan Dean Foster, was given the keys to the kingdom, and he wrote the low-budget sequel for Star Wars that never was. And I think we can all agree it was a good thing, right? That we got The Empire Strikes Back instead of this. I mean, I guess it's debatable. But we are excited to talk about this one. It has been a doozy. Do people still say doozy?
Yeah, they still do.
Surely not. This book has broken my brain. But if this was the first foray into new territory in the Star Wars universe, can you guess what the second expanded universe novel was?
I never actually thought about the second.
It's weird.
It's not Shadows of the Empire, because wasn't that in the 90s?
Right, that's 96, I think.
I mean, that also has a lot of weirdness.
Yeah.
Haven't read that one. We'll have to cover it on the show.
It's got it's got a 90s weird vibe to it for sure.
I know some things about it, but I've been saving it because I know it's such a Legends classic, and I'm kind of saving it near the end so that I've still got some fun stuff to get into when it's all said and done. All right, any other guesses? The second... No cheating, Freddie. I see that Essential Reader's Companion.
I'm just looking at the Splinter Mind's Eye here, just prepping for the show and whatnot. I'm not looking at anything...
likely story.
That's fine. Do y'all give up, or you got any other guesses?
I'd say...
give up.
I'm gonna say go ahead.
All right. So it was the Brian Daley Han Solo book. I'm trying to remember exactly what was the first one. Star's End?
Yeah.
Han Solo at Star's End. Published in 1979. This came out in 1978. The crazy thing about it, so we talk about some behind-the-scenes info here, is that the original concept for this book was, it came up in a discussion between George Lucas and Alan Dean Foster in October of 1976. That's right, they had already started writing this book before Star Wars ever even came out in theaters. Isn't that bonkers?
I
crazy.
didn't know that.
It's crazy. So if you're one of these people who's an absolute nerd about the expanded universe, here's a little bit of fun for you. Star Wars Insider, let's see what issue this was. Issue number 145 came out in December 2013. Followed again by issue 146. Has a 2-part interview, which is actually a transcript of the conversation that took place between George Lucas himself and Alan Dean Foster, all about the behind the scenes brainstorming session that resulted in this really amazing book. And so there's a lot of crazy stuff in there. They considered killing off Leia in this book. George Lucas was feeling jaded about how difficult it was to shoot Star Wars, and so he says, yeah, you could probably kill her off. We'll have to get Eric on the show to get his George Lucas impression for next time. Anything else fun about this book you guys want to pitch in with? There's some really crazy behind-the-scenes stuff with this book, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, there's like the first EU contradiction to the movies, I believe, is the color of the lightsaber that Vader has, and
Vader has a blue lightsaber.
Yeah, and it's like, how did you get that wrong? Pretty sure he always had red.
Yeah, there's some crazy, baffling things in this book. Here's just a few of the tidbits of things that happen in Splinter of the Mind's Eye. First of all, this being pitched as a low-budget, kind of made-for-TV movie, in case Star Wars wasn't really successful, but wasn't a total bomb, so there was still a little bit of money left over. Basically, at this point, George said, let's keep it all on one planet. Let's do it in such a location where it'll be easy to shoot. Keep it all in caves or the forest or in the fog. And so we get the planet of Mimban, of course, which then is featured later in Solo, which I thought was a really cool Legends callback. Also, Harrison Ford hadn't signed on for the sequel, so there's no Han in Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which also means no Chewie. And I think we can all agree the book really suffers for it.
Yeah.
You can kind of feel like without the big three and Chewie, it's kind of it's a very weird, interesting story. Maybe we should just get into it after we go through some interesting facts.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
Of course, this, as Freddie mentioned, has a couple of little contradictions. The one that I want to mention before we move on to the summary here is that Leia can't swim. Did you guys pick up on this?
I did, yeah.
But Luke
that was kind of strange,
is a competent
isn't there a lot
swimmer.
of water on Alderaan?
I know, this is what's crazy. Luke, from a desert planet, very competent swimmer. Leia, of course, who comes from a wealthy family, probably would have had ample opportunity to learn how to swim. She's too scared of the water. There's a lot of stuff like that in this book, but of course the amazing, wonderful, crazy thing is that this was adapted by Dark Horse Comics in 1996 into a 4-issue graphic novel. I actually think that it might be a better way to consume the story. It's still kind of got that 90s comics art to it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But you don't have to deal with some of the purple prose, which we'll get into it in a second. Anything else worth mentioning, guys?
I think the cover art is beautiful. Despite everything that happens, in the book, I think the cover art is absolutely beautiful.
The best thing you could probably do with this book is look at the cover and put it back on the shelf. Oh, goodness. All right, no. Edit that one out, Freddie.
Positivity.
Yeah,
I
of course.
was worried that the scene on the cover was not going to happen in the book because it happened so late. When I got towards the end, I was thinking, like, there's only 20 pages left. They're really going to jip me like this. But it does happen a little bit.
Yeah. It's like we finally gotten to the good part, and then he just flies through it. We'll get on to reviewing the book in a second.
And then falls through it.
And we do need to mention, we'll put this in the show notes, because we can do that now. We'll put the link to the book's cover there. It is actual art by Ralph McQuarrie himself. The Essential Reader's Companion, something that we frequently plug on this show, actually calls it one of the most iconic pieces of art in all of the expanded universe. And I think I agree. Very iconic, gorgeous cover. Really makes the book look mysterious and interesting. And then we get this. So we're going to get into it, guys. This is going to be spoiler-heavy territory. This is your chance to get out now if you don't want to be spoiled. And if you do, Well, here we go. It's about 2 years after the Battle of Yavin, and we've got Luke, Leia, C-3PO, and R2-D2 en route to... and some of these names are going to get me, guys, so I call this Sir Carpus. What do you call it? Sir Carpus 4?
Sir Carpus? Yeah, I think that's right.
Saying it out loud is way weirder than reading it.
It's true.
I don't even want to attempt it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Heather. Just let me do the heavy lifting here. Leia is going to recruit more people to the rebellion. On their way to this very important meeting, their ships crash land in an energy storm. And I'd like to go ahead and say here, of course, Luke is in his X-Wing, Leia is flying a Y-Wing. We can go ahead and blame this entire book on the fact that Leia was in a Y-Wing. Y-Wings are trash. They're the worst ship in all of Star Wars. We can blame it on the Y-Wing. All right, so thanks for listening, everybody. Okay, there's a lot more to it than that. They find themselves frequently in this book going out of the frying pan into the fire. The Empire, of course, secretly has set up an installation to strip mine the planet because, well, that's really what the Empire does best, isn't it? Their ships are totaled in the crash, and as far as I could understand, they eventually sink into the mud after they're abandoned by Luke and Leia. They trek into town, they steal a set of mining clothes, and do what you have to do if you're in a Star Wars story. They go into the cantina to have a drink. From here, they're questioned about the fact that they don't look like they're from around here, and Luke comes up with this genius plan to claim that Leia is his servant girl. And he even slaps her to sell the ruse. You can't make this stuff up, guys.
He slaps her so hard.
He straight up slapped her in order to make this believable. I don't know who it shocked more, Leia or me. And this was my second time reading the book. I had blocked it from my memory.
I think he's always wanted to do that. That's where that came from.
Maybe Alan Dean Foster. Anyway, we won't get into that.
He's like, this is my chance!
Douche.
It does buy them some time, but soon afterward, they're approached by this crazy old woman named Hala. She has an obsession with finding this powerful object called the Kyber crystal that can enhance its holder's connection to the Force. Hala herself is marginally Force sensitive, which really convinces wide-eyed Luke on the idea. So desperate for a new mentor, of course, after the loss of Ben Kenobi, he says, sure, why not? On the way out of the cantina, Leia, not so happy with the slap, confronts Luke for this servant girl routine that he came up with, and they start mud wrestling, y'all. She shoves him, and then he doesn't want to be shoved, and it's a swamp planet. So it kind of makes sense in that way, but anyway, this, of course, catches the attention of some miners who assault them, which escalates the situation even more as they're taken to jail by some stormtroopers. There they find an ambitious Imperial officer, Captain Supervisor Grammel. So he questions them, and after some digging, he finds out that they're wanted rebel agents. Luke, Leia, and the two drunk and burly, as far as I can understand, Wookiee stand-ins called the Yuzum. They're of course in prison. They've been there for days, but they're still drunk. They're sprung from prison as Hala is outside the window and has to combine her powers with Luke to use his meal tray to press the switch to free them from the prison cell. After they escape, they hijack an Imperial vehicle. They're chased by a giant worm. Luke and Leia then fall down a well and have to make their way through a massive, luminous underground cave system inhabited by lake spirits and an indigenous species kind of like Ewoks. There, Luke bests their champion in a duel. The party then is broken up by Vader and a posse of stormtroopers who have finally found the crew that they're looking for. These indigenous people, the Koways is what they're called, they use surprise to their advantage. They murder violently all of the stormtroopers, but Vader escapes to go after the Kyber crystal. And this is, of course, where we get to the book's climactic set piece we mentioned a minute ago, pictured on the front of the novel. In the beautiful Ralph McQuarrie cover art, it's at the Temple of Pomojima, where they are attacked by yet another massive monster. After defeating the monster, the temple begins to crack and crumble, which traps Luke under a pile of rubble just in time for Vader to arrive. He has seemingly killed the two Yuzum outside the temple. But then he sets his sights on killing Luke and Leia. Because Luke is incapacitated, Leia in a burst of feminine rage, takes up Luke's lightsaber and duels Vader. She's out for revenge, of course, for being tortured aboard the Death Star, but Vader eviscerates her, and it's brutal. He leaves her horribly, if not mortally, wounded. At that point, one of the Yuzum, seemingly dead, uses his last ounce of strength to free Luke from the rebels so that he can take up the fight against Vader. There, Luke, of course, is outmatched by Vader, but uses the added strength of the Kyber crystal, which was right there in the temple, to lop off Vader's arm, which is the most Star Wars-y thing in the entire book. Vader, of course, if not this next part, Vader is shocked and accidentally, as far as I can tell, falls into a pit. Because why not?
That's my favorite part, and my least favorite part.
Oh, I know, it's amazing. Luke dies from being exhausted? And then he comes back to life with the power of the Kyber crystal, which he then uses to force heal Leia's wounds as well. Sound familiar, guys?
Oh, yeah.
The amazing thing, of course, is in that George Lucas interview, he and Alan Dean Foster are going back and forth on some plot points for the novel, and Alan Dean Foster comes up with this idea for Luke to die and come back using the Kyber crystal, then to use the Kyber crystal to heal Leia, and George Lucas says, I don't know, it sounds a bit much. And I thought that's amazing. We got George Lucas on record saying, I don't know about that. Of course. Awesome. Heather, at this point, this is where we rate on a 1 to 10 scale like we do on Youtini.com, using plot, characters, originality, writing, entertainment. And I'm almost scared to ask this, but where would you rate Splinter of the Mind's Eye?
Well, I think I'm going to go with a 6.5.
Okay, so on our scale in Youtini, I pulled this up earlier today, we actually have titles accompanying each of the number systems, so I think 6 is okay, if I remember correctly. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
You want to elaborate on why you would give this that score?
Well, let's start with why it took me so long to finish this book. So, the copy that I have right now, I've owned about 10 years ago. I was in high school, which was about 10 years ago. I hate how I just reminded myself about that.
Yeah, same for me.
And, like, literally throughout the 10 years, every now and then, maybe like once every other year, I would pick up the novel and say, like, okay, you know, people have been talking about this book. It's the first EU novel. I need to read this as a Star Wars fan, right?
Right.
But I could
It feels important.
ever... Yes, exactly. Just considering, like, everything behind it, where it came from and everything. But I could never get past the second chapter. So being invited onto the show was actually good for me because I had to literally force myself to read this book, right? And
What a glowing review. I would never have read this if I didn't have to talk about it on a podcast.
Exactly. And reading this the last time, I think one reason why I had trouble reading it was mostly because of the language, and I don't know if this is just like a product of the 70s, but can I read the first paragraph for you guys?
Please.
There's a lot of purple prose in this book.
Okay.
Yeah.
How beautiful was the universe, Luke thought. How beautifully flowing, glorious, and aglow like the robe of a queen. Ice black clean in its emptiness and solitude, so unlike the motley collage of spinning dust motes men call... I don't want to finish that. So... that is why I've had a hard time reading this book, but now that I've finished it, you know, I didn't hate it as much as I thought I would, and I think it's because I went into this book pretty much thinking of it as, like, an alternate universe, not really to expand on the movies, because, like you guys said, there are so many contradictions in this book, there's no way that you could properly place it, like, within the same story as the films. But if you think about the book as like, oh, it could have been like this, then it's actually kind of interesting. And some parts are just hilarious, even though they don't mean to be. But it's entertaining in that way. So I give it an okay, because I don't think it's a complete waste to read this book.
Yeah, this is what we could have gotten if we didn't get The Empire Strikes Back.
Which thankfully we got that.
I guess. You know, I was really digging Hala as a character. Anyway, let's see what you think, Freddie.
You know, the first time I read this book a long time ago, and it was during the time, I think it was during the 90s actually when I read it, and I was pretty young, and I just didn't get it. I was like, this doesn't make sense. I don't understand this book. And I didn't have the resources to say, this is what could have happened. I thought it was just another book with the rest of everything, right?
Right.
So I was thinking, how is this possible? This book makes no sense. It doesn't fall in line with anything. I just don't get it. So I at that time, and that was probably up until I started learning about more of the history of the book and etc. But that was around a 1. I would say this time, taking in context of when it was written, why it was written, I would say I would put it around a 5. And I say that because there's still a lot of things in the book that are just like, it's so hard to get past. And I wrote it in one of my final thoughts, which was when they're in the cave, right, and they're fighting, and Vader, it says he shook his threatening fist in Luke's general direction.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, oh man. Okay.
They clearly hadn't quite figured Vader out as a villain.
Yeah.
But they were on the right track in some ways. Yeah, and you kind of just deflated my theory, Freddie, which is I was going to say this book would be perfect for a 12-year-old. But that's not true, because the writing style in this is so incredibly obtuse.
Yeah, it is.
I actually had a quote pulled out too. Can I play this game?
Yeah, do it.
Page 7. Luke fought his own instrumentation. It flaunted a farrago of electronic nonsense at him. The madly buckling X-Wing was held in the grip of unidentified forces powerful enough to toss it about like a plaything. A chaotic storm vanished behind him as if he'd suddenly emerged from a waterspout, but his controls continued to exhibit what were probably permanent I can't even get my mouth around this. Oh my gosh, I'm done. All right. The writing style in this, I think, is what holds it back in large part, which is why I recommend the graphic novel. Even then, you can tell that George Lucas and Alan Dean Foster just couldn't quite come to an agreement on what points were worth exploring in this book and which ones weren't. George had some really cool ideas for this book, which if you really break it down, you can see them and start to understand where this could have gone, or at least where he was coming from in crafting this story. I think in a lot of ways it harkens back to these old, Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon serials, which is this action-adventure hero. In a lot of ways, it's an Indiana Jones book with Darth Vader in the end.
Mm-hmm.
They're just going out of the frying pit into the fire, mustache-twirly villains. And even then, it still just doesn't quite work. Now, for me, I'd probably give this a 4.7. I just can't even give it a 5. I know. But I didn't think that the first time I read it. So, I would like to think that I just didn't have as good an experience with it this time around. I think that knowing some of the background helps. Having some of this behind-the-scenes information makes it more interesting. Oh, man. The characters, the writing style. Let's talk about these characters. Go ahead, Freddie.
Oh, I was going to say one last thing before we get into the characters. I think one way you should take this book, if you want to enjoy it for what it is just the history of Star Wars and how it got from this point to Episode 5, right? From 4 to 5. Just take it through.
I think that's what helped me enjoy it.
Yeah.
Right. In a lot of ways, this might be the most documented Legends book, with the exception possibly of Heir to the Empire. There is so much behind-the-scenes information you can dig up on this. And so maybe even the behind-the-scenes is more interesting than the story itself. I'll leave that up to you, listeners. Let's talk about some of these characters here. Let's start with Luke. This book really shows a very immature Luke. So let me ask you, where would Luke be? Put yourself in Luke's shoes. Are they shoes in Star Wars? Are they space moon boots?
Like boots.
Anyway.
If they are, they're way too big for me.
Where would Luke be without receiving more Jedi training from Master Yoda? We've actually had a few books, in recent years that have kind of taken us back to this Luke. In a lot of ways, the Luke of the Legends universe is the Return of the Jedi Luke, on steroids. Luke is almost infallible. He's the Grandmaster of the Jedi Order. He makes some mistakes along the way, but he is held with reverence. But this Luke is really, really fallible. He's making a lot of rash decisions, mentioning slapping Leia being one of them. He wants to be this action hero, but he's not a Jedi. Not even remotely. I think Heir to the Jedi, one of the first canon books, shows us this kind of a Luke, as well as the recent Marvel comic that just wrapped up and they're rebooting. That has shown us Luke in this era, after A New Hope, before Empire. So where do you think Luke would be if he hadn't gone to Dagobah?
He wouldn't be anywhere, really. I mean, in each film, you see some sort of progression in his training and in his personality, but in this book, with nobody to mentor him, he's kind of stuck where he's at, and he's even kind of even went backwards a little bit. I don't know if you guys remember the scene when he's pinned underneath the rubble and Leia is the one facing Darth Vader. He says, "Leia, kill me and then kill yourself. Like, we just can't do this fight." And the Luke that we know in the true original stories, like, he would never just he wouldn't just give up like that to the point where they would just commit suicide like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good one. I think it just goes to show how important Yoda's training was to him. And yeah, we didn't really see too much of it besides, what we did see in the movies. But the growth that he experienced on Dagobah was exponential compared to, anything before that. Before that, he was probably just sitting there like, oh, I've got these powers, but how the heck do I use them? I don't know what to do. And that's
and what kind of training did he even receive from Ben?
Yeah,
he was handed a lightsaber. He got shot by that ball on the Millennium Falcon, and that's about it.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's no cutaways from between Tatooine and them taking off, right? Like it's basically like a full thing where when they were on Dagobah, we don't know everything that happened there, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that seems to be where the training takes place, and then the period between Empire and Return of the Jedi, there's huge growth in that period. But you just got to put yourself reading this book in the shoes of Luke Skywalker, who just saved the galaxy, has a big head, a lightsaber, and no mentor. And, of course, accompanying him in this book is Princess Leia herself. Guys, let me ask you, Freddie, let's start with you. How would you begin to describe just how horribly mischaracterized Leia is in this book?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't get the same vibe that it's her. It feels like I'm reading a different character with the same name. That's how I felt. And I'm not sure if it's just she feels like either too much of a princess or is kind of bratty in some sense. I couldn't really pin it down, but when I finished reading this again, I was just like, I still had the same feeling, like this is definitely not Leia, and it was so obvious to me.
Yeah, Foster keeps calling her the princess, air quotes here, instead of Leia. He's not thinking about her as a senator. He mentions it once or twice. He, of course, leaves her on the Y-Wing waiting for Luke in the beginning, instead of the Leia that we know, who, of course, ended up being the one who rescued them from the Death Star. She was not the damsel in distress, but instead here she comes up with this idea of, oh, Luke will come and find me. I should stay with the ship. From the beginning I realized, oh no, we are in for it here. But what do you think, Heather? What do you think is the problem with Leia in this book?
Well, I'm glad you pointed out the whole waiting in the Y-Wing thing, because I thought the same thing. The Leia that we know wouldn't just sit around and wait. She wouldn't be able to sit still. She would take action. And I'm really glad that the true Leia evolved into like how we know her now, like this really strong leader. Because in this book, again, it might just be a product of the 70s, but they really stuck with the whole spoiled princess trope. And like when she got mud on her clothes, she was complaining, and I thought about like, the Leia that I know, she wouldn't care about having some mud on her clothes. Like, it was a bit painful to visualize her like that. Freddie, you're right, she just seemed like a completely different person.
There are some interesting things that shine through, and I think maybe the best moment in the book is when Leia doesn't even think about it. when Luke is trapped, Vader walks in, she is out to kill. There's a previous scene even where they're trapped in the caves and Vader shows up with the stormtroopers and Leia is just gunning him down. She actually hits him in the cape. And so I guess he has a really, invulnerable cape or something. It doesn't even contact his body. But how cool, Heather, was Leia's saber use in this book? Let's start first with that great scene at the end of Splinter here.
Maybe that's why they depicted her as the spoiled damsel in distress in the beginning, because that scene at the end that you mentioned actually really surprised me because it's so much different than what we were just seeing before. And
Right.
I think if she really was the Leia that we knew from the beginning up until that point, that scene wouldn't have been as shocking because we would think like, oh yeah, that's just how she rolls. So maybe that's why they did it. Maybe it was just a design choice. I don't know.
Yeah, I thought this. So, in my opinion, the real Leia, I guess, the one that I know, you literally see in the last chapter. It takes till the
Right.
last chapter until you see her, and it could be brought on because of fear, but I'm not sure why they took so long to bring it out of her. But she was just she was shooting at him. Imagine her just in the back with a blaster rifle, just scoping this guy and just trying to shoot Vader. But then she just gets that lightsaber, goes right after him, and mind you, Vader is a extremely skilled duelist, right? So
Right.
we kind of know how it's going to end, but the fact that she even gets a few parries in and whatnot, it's pretty fascinating.
Absolutely. In terms of our heroes from A New Hope who translate into this book, we've got Luke, we've got Leia, but then accompanying them are R2-D2 and C-3PO, and they're used very sparingly. I think that when Foster writes them, he does a really good job. They've got some good back and forth, especially at the beginning and at the very end again. But they are criminally underutilized. Besides that, there's really no other major heroes from the original movie that make their way into this book. Of course, Ben Kenobi's dead. Taking his place in this book is a mysterious old witch on Mimban named Hala. She's an old lady. Foster says in behind-the-scenes material that he really loves trying to write older characters, not as caricatures. And I admire that in so many ways. I don't think he achieves it with Hala. So how would you describe Hala? What's the deal with her, Heather? Why is she motivated to find the Kyber crystal?
Well, first I'll say, it's funny that you call her Hala, and it's kind of throwing me off because when I was reading, I imagined the name as like Hala.
Holla!
But, I don't think they really made it clear what her motives were other than her having some kind of force sensitivity. And even then, like, it's not that impressive. Like, when you first when you first see her in the bar and she's like clearly straining herself just to move like a salt shaker. I can't remember if it was a salt shaker or something. It was something very minuscule just sitting on the table, and she like barely nudged it to the side, and she's just like panting and sweating. And when Luke was saying like, okay, I believe you now, I couldn't tell if they were just joking, like, wow, this chick kind of doesn't really know what she's talking about, or if they actually were impressed with what she did. Because in this book, it's kind of unclear their knowledge of the Force because going into this book, I thought the Force would have a much bigger role in the story. I knew the Force had something to do with the story, but it's hardly been touched on at all in this novel.
The Force is kind of its own thing in this, and even behind the scenes stuff, George Lucas is still trying to figure it out. He's still trying to explore what exactly is the Force, and he's like, yeah, I had something in one of the earlier drafts about there being a crystal that could amplify the Force. You can use that if you want.
Like, and hardly any of them have used it. Like, well, when Darth Vader was fighting Luke and the lightsaber just dropped on the floor, they were all lunging towards it instead of using the force to try to, take it that way. They were just like running towards the lightsaber, seeing who could get to it first. And I'm like, what are you doing?
Yeah, because I think the first instance that we get of, on screen at least, of calling the lightsaber to oneself using the force is Luke in the ice cave with the Wampa. Is that right? So there was nothing established in canon that could even happen. I had the exact same thought, Heather.
Oh,
for me,
right.
with Hala, or what'd you say, Hella?
Hala.
It's getting late, guys. At least on the East Coast here. What she illustrated to me is how painfully clear it is that it was going to be really hard to follow Alec Guinness's Obi-Wan Kenobi with another mentor, a Jedi mentor for Luke, which just goes to show how incredible of a character Yoda is. Maybe Alan Dean Foster is a genius for giving us a character who intentionally falls short, if that's what he's trying to go for here. You want to take a crack at Hala, Freddie?
So, this is kind of the visual that I have of Hala. But
going with Hala.
she's kind of, I picture her as kind of like a creepy Mel Brooks old lady witch, or like a Monty Python, where like, imagine something's happening and you're like, what, how did you get there? And it's like
yeah.
Yeah, and you're right, it's kind of funny how she's like, look how I'm a master of it, and she like barely moves the salt shaker. For all we know, she could have bumped the table. But yeah, I just got this, I did get a character vibe from her of this like kind of useless but kind of wise at the same time, and a little
definitely
creepy.
Eccentric.
Yeah, a little creepy, a little eccentric. Yeah, I mean, definitely does not have the same vibe as Alec Guinness or Yoda, right? Or Ben Kenobi or Yoda, or any strong mentor, in my opinion. It almost seemed like in some cases she was just bothering them.
Have you both played Knights of the Old Republic 2 with Kreia?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So I was reading this and I thought, there's something they could have done that would have worked if they had established Hala just a little bit differently as kind of a Kreia character who is like this old witch mentor who comes alongside and knows about the Force, but you can't quite discern her motives. And then at the end has a huge twist and you find out that she was actually the real villain the whole time. And I was so excited to get there, and it never did. So, once again, headcanon. Something cool they could have done there. But on a positive note, there are a couple of really cool original characters in this book, and that is the Yuzum, replacing Chewbacca, kind of a stand-in for the big furry burly character in this book. We've got the brothers Hin and Ki, the Yuzum. What did you think of the Yuzum as sidekicks in these books, Freddie?
I actually like them a lot. They were definitely some of my favorite beasts in this book. They're just like these burly, saber-toothed kind of looking guys, and we can post some pictures. But they were definitely one of my favorites, and the fact that their hangover lasted who knows how long, days.
They're clearly down on their luck when they're in prison, but then they show up to be heroic after that. You kind of think they're bums, but then they come through in the end.
Yeah, and they were actually some of my favorite characters in this book. I liked them. Yeah,
what about you, Heather?
I could tell that they were trying to replace Chewie, and he just can't be replaced. But I did love him. I noticed that. And because I really wanted to know what they looked like, so I did a Google image search on them, and apparently in the graphic novel, they do look very similar to Wookiees, and which is completely different from what I've read in their description, because, being in this galaxy with all these planets and all these species, Luke and Leia have seen a great number of them, so to be as scared as they were when first seeing these creatures, they had to look like something totally out of the ordinary in their world, right? And what I imagined with just hair everywhere and the trunk, maybe they said snout and I imagined it as a trunk, I'm not sure, but also the arms being longer than their bodies, so like the back of their hands kind of just drag along the floor. What I imagined was a two-legged version of that thing on Sesame Street, the Snuffleupagus.
Oh no. All right, guys, thanks for listening. The episode's over.
So that's how I imagined them the entire time, and I love them all the same.
I pictured in Rogue One, part of Saw Gerrera's band of partisans, there's this big white furry alien named Moroff. That's what I pictured all the way through the book. And I like the way that they were pictured in the graphic novel. I do have one key question, though, with the Yuzum. Why in the world does Luke speak their language?
That's a good point.
It seems to me that Leia, coming from wealth and success, that she would have had more opportunity for education, could have learned more alien languages. Luke, though, I mean, there's some weird aliens on Tatooine, but he's a farmer. It would make sense to me if he could speak Jawa, but would he have time to learn Jawa and Yuzum? Anyway, that's one of these things.
I see it as like a missed opportunity to have the droids around, because it would make sense for 3PO to know their language. And
yes,
I don't even know. Yeah, I don't even know why they would be in the story, because in the movies, I forgot where I heard this from, but C3PO and R2D2 are supposed to be like the story keepers. They've been around through everything, and like they've seen it all. But in this story, they're not even around. Like you see them here and there, but they're not really part of the adventure.
I feel like it might have been a little overwhelming to try to write that many characters, because I think he might have wanted to just stick with Luke and Leia and Hala, right, just doing their thing, and maybe some Yuzum here and there.
Why did there need to be two Yuzum?
yeah, I mean that's a good point, right?
This book is bonkers. Yeah,
that's a good point.
There are two of them. One of them saves the day in the end, but Luke speaks their language. As we're wrapping up the character-focused section of the show, we do need to mention that there is, of course, this Imperial villain who's just kind of, working from his own ambition. Captain Supervisor Grammel, he's just trying to get ahead. He tries to maneuver his way, both in terms of interrogation with Luke and Leia, but then also with his Imperial higher-ups to try to maneuver for a promotion. I don't remember the book saying this, but the graphic novel shows Vader splitting him in half, long ways, hot dog style, head to toe, before he throws him off the top of the Imperial walker. But then Vader just totally does away with him. So briefly here, how does Captain Supervisor Grammel's own ambition ultimately end up being his undoing, Heather?
Grammel, I feel like he could have been interesting, but they really rushed him. I could tell they were trying to go with the whole, when you first see him, he's, well established, in control of the whole situation. But almost immediately after that, I want to say, even the next chapter, he confronts Luke and Leia in the cell, and he just immediately goes to, the strands of hair coming out, who are you? Just, going insane. And in order for that to be effective, you need to, draw that out a bit. But they don't do that at all in this book. And, I mean, once Vader touches down on the planet, there's just, that's it with Grammel. He could have been an interesting character.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But they didn't really utilize him that much.
You want to add anything, Freddie?
Yeah, I think they should have gone the Grand Moff Tarkin approach, where he's just really cold and ruthless and bitter. But I think he showed way too much emotion. And, once Vader touched down, he was just pretty much done after that. There was no more of him.
I actually really enjoyed Vader doing away with him. Vader in this book, interestingly enough, this book started in development before James Earl Jones was ever hired. So George Lucas in the early cuts of the movie didn't really feel like Vader was working as a villain. Boy, was he wrong about that. So at this point in this book, Vader's kind of a boogeyman. He's also kind of foreboding at the same time. He doesn't appear until very late in the book, and funnily enough, I've got to mention this, guys, did you notice the one-liner where he calls Leia a girl woman?
Yeah, it's so funny.
I don't remember that.
Yeah, go back and read chapter 12, the only good chapter in the book.
No, thanks.
The best chapter of the book. And yeah, Leia faces off against him with a lightsaber, and he says, "Do you think you can stop me, girl woman?"
Oh my goodness.
Leia damages his breathing apparatus, and then Luke lops off one of his arms, and then he falls down the pit used for sacrifices. So what did you think of Vader's fate, Freddie?
Yeah, it was a little underwhelming. I mean, it's just, you can kind of see it in the book. He didn't die. He was probably coming back. The best way Star Wars knows how, right? Just going down a pit and coming out
Fell
with
down the
legs.
shaft, right? Spider legs?
Spider legs. Yeah, it's got the same vibe. So that was very Star Warsy to me. It was like, okay, I've heard this before. And this is obviously the first instance of it. So there it is.
Definitely fell down the shaft. How many years? A good, 5 years before Palpatine did. Heather, what do you think about Vader and Splinter here?
One thing I'm going to point out kind of has to do with Luke's character as well, but when Luke chopped off Vader's right arm, and Vader switches his lightsaber wielding to his left hand, I think it's funny when Luke says, like, that's it, he's invincible, you just can't win against him. And I'm just like, well, just chop off the other arm. Then what is he gonna do? You're like halfway there. Don't give up now. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, he lopped off Vader's arm and then immediately despairs. Like, oh, I guess I can't beat him. I was like, you're doing pretty good.
Yeah. Like Star Wars 101. Chop off the limbs and you're good.
Okay, I've got some big questions about Splinter here, okay? Some huge, massive questions,
I'm not
okay? What's more disturbing, Splinter of the Mind's Eye or the Holiday Special?
Oh, dude, this is actually a very easy one for me.
Me too.
Yeah, Holiday Special is extremely disturbing to me. Every time.
Okay, but in Splinter of the Mind's Eye, Luke is obsessed with trying to make something with his relationship with Leia. How have we made it an hour into this episode and haven't talked about this yet?
I know, that's funny. That's like one of the first things I feel like we would have talked about, but kind of, you got to imagine they still at this point didn't even know, right? They didn't know until the very end, basically.
I'm just gonna I just had to keep reminding myself of that all the way through this book. Luke doesn't know Leia is his sister.
Yeah, and they just make it.
Does
he makes
George
it too
even know
obvious.
that yet?
I don't think he.
What's that?
I don't think he does yet. I'm not sure if George knew it yet.
I don't think that George is best I understand. I don't think he settles on that until he's writing the screenplay for Return of the Jedi and he's trying to tie up loose ends. But I could be wrong. There's a scene early in the book where Luke is talking about being pressed up against Leia and feeling her body heat, and I was like, oh, I don't know if I can do this. I might just have to lie to Heather and Freddie and tell them that I reread this. But
But it makes me wonder
I made it through.
If back when people were reading this when it was first released before Empire Strikes Back, like nobody knew that they were siblings, right? It made me wonder, like, how many people were actually into it.
Good point. Shippers, original shippers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's clearly going to either be with Luke or Han. And so this is the alternate universe where Luke is at least trying harder to get the girl. Not that he ever really succeeds in this book. And it's a good thing that he doesn't, I think we can all say.
Yeah.
It's a good thing that it doesn't progress farther than it does in this book.
So true. Because if it did, that would make things a little worse in the reread. But yeah, Holiday Special, that's my vote.
Well, as we think about some of the things that stand out as odd and disturbing in this book, there's one thing that really, I think, has been adopted through the Star Wars canon from here. This is something that came up in one of George Lucas's early drafts for Star Wars that he then handed off to Foster to use in this book, and that's the concept of the Kyber crystal. So Kyber is spelled differently. It has a different purpose, a different use, where it can magnify one's ability to use the Force. From there, kyber crystals take on a really interesting role in the Star Wars canon. As best I understand, they were adopted in the Clone Wars animated series. We find the lore surrounding kyber crystals expanded upon in some really powerful and profound ways, where kyber crystals do have some kind of a connection to the Force. You've got the whole Padawans finding their kyber crystals on Ilum arc of Clone Wars, which is great. So how do we see the function of kyber crystals playing in this book? And then let me ask you, how do we see kyber crystal lore evolve over the years?
That's an interesting one. So in this book, they seem like it's almost like catnip to the Jedi, right? Where they just get this interesting vibe off of it and whatnot. And I believe it goes, and there's several things. I mean, if you look at the history of Legends and the Clone Wars and all this other stuff, it goes from being this thing that's like a Force attunement to I believe in Clone Wars it was the lightsaber crystals, and then also it was used to, I think it was used as a crystal, as like almost like a power device for Holocron to find all the children that are Force sensitive.
Right.
Yeah, so I know there's several things throughout history of Star Wars canon and Legends.
Kyber crystal can do whatever is relevant to the plot.
Yeah, exactly.
As far as I'm concerned. Interestingly enough, the Essential Reader's Companion says that if you really are determined to make this book fit into Legends continuity, the Kyber crystal can be explained in this way. That is, Luke, of course, uses the Kyber crystal at the end of the book, but then he takes it. He's got the Kyber crystal at the end, and Pablo Hidalgo says the best way to explain it is that the Kyber crystal's effects get weaker the farther it is from Mimban. So Luke still has it, but this entire book was for nothing because it doesn't actually help him in the end. Which I thought was a convenient explanation. The Kyber crystals get an interesting role here. I think it's a great MacGuffin for this book. It's very adventure-esque, taking the item from the idol in the temple, kind of Indiana Jonesy in a way that I thought worked pretty well. But, for me, the number one takeaway I have from Splinter as we get close to wrapping it up here, guys, is this book really highlights for me the importance of The Empire Strikes Back. Just how important is The Empire Strikes Back for expanding on Star Wars in the right ways in comparison with this book?
Well, I think with The Empire Strikes Back, thank goodness that we got that right. It added so much more to the overall lore, and you could really expand on that. But with this book, as a sequel, it didn't really offer much. I couldn't see how this story could continue from this book. It kind of just seems like its own little circle, and I don't know. It's just hard to explain. The Splinter of the Mind's Eye kind of felt pointless in that it didn't really add to the lore. The whole Kyber crystal thing, I thought it was a neat concept how it could expand on the Force user's abilities instead of just needing a catalyst to let the power out. But even then, other than the Force healing at the end, you don't really get to see that. Luke, he was fighting that one guy. He passed out and somehow won the fight, even though, he doesn't remember it. And I thought maybe they would explain how the Force had something to do with it, but they never explain it. And, with the Force healing, it's even kind of impractical because you need the crystal the size of your head in order to do that. No one's going to be keeping that in their wallet,
Back pocket.
Yeah.
Giant pocket. Yeah, that's a good point. My take on it is this is not a sequel book, right? This book should not be a sequel. And even if they were trying to do a low budget sequel, it just doesn't have the giant plot, the giant twists. It seems like it kind of goes linear, and then it just maybe has a plot, and it's last page, right, or the last chapter, and it just shows you that
it's not a space opera.
It's not an opera. It is literally just like an episode, right? Maybe a 20-minute episode. And that's what it feels like.
I think of it as a good made-for-TV movie.
Yeah, and I believe
Or
that's
it has the bones to be a good made-for-TV movie.
Yeah, it does. And I feel like that's kind of the point that he wanted to go. If this didn't work, he was going to go with a live-action cheap something that, just like the serials that he used to watch, where they have an adventure a day, right? And that just goes to show you that how much content and how much story was in Empire Strikes Back is so significant. It was an absolute journey from the beginning of that movie to the end, right?
Right.
And then you see
and
this
three
book.
things that are...
Yeah, and you're just kind of like... No, I was just going to say, if you see this book and it doesn't compare.
And three things that are crucial to that, to Empire being the success that it is, that are just totally lacking from this, would be the relationship between Han and Leia, because you don't get Han at all in this. You've also, of course, got Yoda stepping in as the Jedi mentor to propel Luke forward on his journey. And then Lando. We all need a rogue smuggler in our life, and instead we get Hala. Oh, do we ever get Hala. So as we wrap it up, y'all, tell me, final thoughts. It's your last chance. Anything you need to get off your chest with Splinter of the Mind's Eye, because I will not be returning to this one anytime soon. I can tell you that much. Favorite scene, worst scene, whatever you feel like you've got left over, Freddie.
Okay, I say I read this on Amazon. This book spans 12 chapters, but it really doesn't get to the main point until the 12th chapter. So,
yeah,
you could probably read the first chapter and then the last two, and that if you want a quick summary, that's all you need.
Yeah, get a good taste of it.
Yeah, muscle or mud wrestling, and then shaking fists. I think all of those things made it like a fun read again, because sometimes you take yourself too seriously with a lot of these Legends books, and just Star Wars books in general. And if you want to just like have a good laugh or just kind of chill out and not think so seriously about it, I think this is definitely something you can read if you really feel like it, but not necessary.
Yeah, Freddie, I definitely agree with you. If you go into this book not taking it seriously, it is an interesting ride. One part that really sticks to me, I don't know if you guys watch Red Letter Media on YouTube, they're movie critics, but they watch these very bad, like, indie films or whatever, and this one guy, every time something crazy happens on screen, he goes like, "Oh my god!" And I almost did that in the scene where Luke and Leia had to break into this hut or whatever to steal those miner clothes, and Luke's just like, "Hold on, I got this." And it said that he was messing with the settings on his lightsaber, and I'm like, wait,
oh, no.
Lightsabers have settings? Like, what is he doing? He turns it on, and it's like the size of... Yes, it's like the size of a toothpick, and he uses that, like, as a lockpick to fiddle with the door and just hatch it open without, like, having to slice through it. And, I don't know, I think that is my favorite part, because...
You know what would have been funny?
What?
If he accidentally left it on that setting when he was fighting Vader.
It just turns it on.
There's so many things in this book that if you read it with like that little bit twisted perspective, I was just rolling all the way through this. I really was laughing a lot. I came to a realization in reading this that, I really think it's probably one of the worst Star Wars books that's out there, and it's not all its fault. There's still so much to develop with Star Wars lore. I know I've given this a low score, but it's kind of fun. It's an interesting experiment. It's a fun trip down an alternate timeline, kind of like if you'd gotten into the DeLorean and then you tried to go back in time, but Biff had taken the almanac and then everything's distorted. What would it look like if Han wasn't in the sequel? It's this dark future. But I did come to this realization. This might be the worst Star Wars book now in 2020. But if you think about it, at one point, this was one of the top 2, if not the best Star Wars book ever written. If you go all the way back to 1978, it was just this in the novelization. So at that point, it's top 5.
Top 5.
Yeah, I guess if you
so
put
it's
it
got
that
that
way.
going for it.
At one point in time, it was at least the second best book. Yeah, you're welcome. Alan Dean Foster, actually from here, went on to write a few more Star Wars books. Interestingly enough, Lucasfilm offered him every year
for several years in a row after this for him to write another Star Wars book. He kept turning them down. Instead, he's written in a lot of other major franchises. Alan Dean Foster's written titles for Alien, even Transformers. He's written adaptations of the J.J. Abrams Star Trek films. He's written a total of 4 Star Wars books. He ghost wrote the original Star Wars novelization, as we mentioned. He, of course, wrote Splinter. From that point, he actually took a huge break, came back to Star Wars in the early aughts, and wrote the Attack of the Clones prequel novel, The Approaching Storm. And his most recent book was the #1 New York Times bestseller, the novelization of The Force Awakens. Amazing that Alan Dean Foster went from here to a #1 New York Times bestseller in the Star Wars universe. I say good for him.
Yeah. That's good.
Good for him. Way to honor his legacy. So that about does it for this week. We want to, of course, plug our collections. Heather has even written some of our collections. And with this one, it's kind of a stretch to think about what would be a good curated UTini reading guide for further reading. We don't have a reading guide of totally bonkers books that'll break your brain, but we'll have to start working on that. But we do have reading guides on the characters of Luke, Leia, Darth Vader, and I believe that Heather even wrote a romance collection. Was that you, Heather?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, so if you're all into that Luke and Leia romance, this book is not featured, thankfully, in that collection.
And it will not be. Keep this book out of my collection.
Okay, good. It's a very well-written collection. We've also got a film-centric guide for A New Hope, which would be relevant in this regard if you want some more of, what does life look like for Luke right after blowing up the Death Star. We've got some big news, of course, as we wrap up here. Just in time for Valentine's Day, Stacy's going to be joining us in our next episode to discuss another absolutely insane Star Wars book, and that is The Courtship of Princess Leia. What else says Happy Valentine's Day like Force Witches and Rancors? Am I right?
Yeah.
That does it for this week. Thanks, Heather, for joining us. And thanks for listening to Legends Look Back, everybody. In the meantime, you can follow along with all things Legends Look Back in our Utini Discord channel. I'm on Twitter as Jared Q. Mays. Freddie?
At Wake Up Freddy.
And Heather is on Twitter.
Heather G, that's spelled Heythurg.
Also, if you're looking to buy some of these books, you want to help support the show, you can go to Utini, click the Amazon link in the profile, or even click the link in the show notes this week. You can even get The Courtship of Princess Leia for $4.99 on Kindle. What a steal. Another way to help out the show and show your love of Utini is to grab some of our swag from TeePublic. We also want to plug that if you read this book, please head on over to utini.com and leave us a review. Let us know what you think. Remember, please keep the Utini fan code, be a force for positivity in the fandom, and more than anything, may the Force be with you.
This is a Utini broadcast.